Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello everyone. My name is Gabriel Simmer. I'm a support engineer at CircleCI, and today we're going to be talking about pipelines in CircleCI and how they can improve your project's configurations and the new API changes and all of that good stuff. I'm joined by Angelisa and Jonathan, who will be hanging out in chat to answer any questions you might have. We will also have time at the end for some Q&A. We will be recording this webinar and sending it out afterwards. So if you missed something, don't worry. We will be sending this out after. So what are we talking about today? We will first be looking at the progression of running jobs within CircleCI. So we will talk a little bit about CircleCI 1.0. We will talk about 2.0, which is where we currently are. And then we will go into 2.1, which is where we're going and where pipelines are present. We will talk about some of the advantages of pipelines and how to enable them, and then we will dive into some of the advantages a little bit more in depth. So this includes Orbs and reusable configuration, the new API that we will be rolling out, our new UI, which has been in preview for a little while. We will touch on how this is going to affect existing configurations and jobs, and then we will head into our Q&A. So, a little bit of a history lesson. We're going to talk about the progression of CircleCI jobs and configuration. In CircleCI 1.0, we didn't really have a concept of workflows. We had a very rigid set of jobs that would be run, depending which ones are defined in the configuration. These would run sequentially, and they would be run in full-on virtual machines rather than Docker machines that we have now. This is no longer being used. It was phased out March 15th, 2019, and moved us into CircleCI 2.0, which is where we currently are. This introduced the workflows feature, so much more flexibility with the jobs that are being run. We introduced job splitting as well. We have much better backing infrastructure than 1.0. And we also have first-class Docker support. So the jobs can be run in dedicated Docker images rather than virtual machines. And then we're moving into CircleCI 2.1, which is where pipelines are being introduced as well. This is sort of the next level of CircleCI, where we're able to do a lot more with configurations and the underlying infrastructure of the platform. So we're introducing the Orbs, reusable configuration, and reworking our API and UI to take advantage of this. We're going to dive into some of the advantages of pipelines. As mentioned before, so we have reusable configurations. We will talk a little bit more in depth about this in a little bit, but this is essentially allowing you to define a set of instructions that your jobs can use, that your jobs and your various projects can use and share. We are rolling out a new modern API. Along with this new modern API, we are rolling out something called pipeline parameters, which we will get into in a little bit, but will allow you to pass through data from your API calls to the pipelines and the workflows and jobs themselves, and also better compatibility with our new UI. On the right here, there's a diagram of where this fits in. Previously, the VCS provider would interact directly with workflows, which would coordinate the jobs. We are adding this pipelines layer in, which will take in the data being sent to us from the VCS provider and allows us to be a lot more flexible and process that configuration differently. Breaking this down a little bit further, so each pipeline is a collection of workflows that run whenever a new commit is pushed to a repository or a new pull request is opened. Each one is a collection of workflows, and each workflow is a collection of jobs. And you can see how that trickles down here. Enabling pipelines is fairly straightforward. If you have recently created a project, it will already be enabled. But if you have an older project that does not have this enabled, or you just want to double check, you can head over to the project settings, go under the advanced settings tab, and then click enable pipelines. Note that this is opt-in only. Once this is turned on, you will not be able to opt out. And this is mostly for pushing people towards using pipelines, as this is where we are heading. On the right here, we have a configuration example. This is also valid under 2.0. It's important to note the version is 2.1 rather than 2.0. This is how this is how our infrastructure is told that you are going to be utilizing this expanded feature set, and that we should process it as such. Next, we're going to talk about Orbs and reusable configuration. This is one of our flagship features that we are utilizing pipelines for, and they are sets of YAML that can be used across projects and across configurations. Specifically with Orbs, they can be used across projects, and they define a template for executors, steps, and jobs, which can be utilized across different projects with parameters that can be passed through. These can be included in the configuration itself, and it can also be pushed to the Orb registry, which we will touch on momentarily. Here on the right here, we have an example of how an orb might be used. So we are pulling in the Slack orb, and then we are calling it in our steps. So we're calling the status command from the Slack orb, and we're passing through a list of user IDs to mention and a webhook. This would be the webhook that the curl request makes a request to actually send the data. But this is just an example of instead of having to hard code this curl request into our configuration in our repository, we can instead pull in the configuration from an external orb, and it will populate for us, and it will have predefined flags for that command as well that we know work. Orbs can be found in the orb registry. This is a centralized registry that houses a number of orbs. We have first party or certified orbs, which live under the CircleCI namespace. We also have a number of partner orbs, which are from companies that we have worked with specifically to ensure that their orbs function correctly. And then there's also a number of community orbs as well, which we have not necessarily certified, but we know or that are available for use in your configurations. These can be found at circleci.com/orbs and circleci.com/orbs/registry. All of the documentation for using an orb is generated from the orb source itself. So you'll be able to view usage examples if they're provided by the orb maker. You'll be able to see previous releases of the orb itself. You'll be able to view the entirety of the orb source as well if you'd like to audit your dependencies. You can also see the various parameters and usage examples that each command or executor or job requires to function. Writing orbs, it's all YAML based, so there's no need to learn a new scripting language or to utilize an existing one. It's all done in YAML, which is very similar to configurations already written for projects in CircleCI. And we do provide an orb starter kit as well, which comes with some examples and a pre-configured CircleCI configuration that can let you hit the ground running for integrating CI/CD into your Orb workflow. Here on the right here, we have sort of an example of how an orb might function. So we're defining a command, say hello. We're giving it a description. This is optional, but is best practice to have some context for that command. We're defining a parameter. These are typed. So you can see we're giving it the string type. We've named it two. We've given it the string type. We've also given it a default value as well. And then we've defined the steps that we want to run and how we want to act when this particular command is called. All we're doing is echoing out the to parameter. And then you can see just below how we would call this in a configuration. We would call the say hello and then pass through a to value. So rather than having to type out run echo parameters or run echo pipelines, you'd instead just call say hello to pipelines. Next, we're going to move into the API and talk a little bit about how the new 2.0 API is going to be replacing the 1.0 API. So API 1.0 and 1.1 were very much based on the concept of jobs. There was some awareness of workflows, but it doesn't quite fit in to the new architecture that we are moving to and the new hierarchy that we're moving to with the pipelines, workflows, and jobs. This is still totally functional. We've only phased out one endpoint for triggering jobs, and that is something that we announced on our blog a little while ago. So while we're still maintaining this, we will slowly be encouraging people to move to the new V2 API. The new V2 API is based on the pipelines workflow job hierarchy. So it's very aware of that. It integrates with that very well. We've also made a minor improvement to how requests are done. Previously, the CircleCI API key would be passed through with either an HTTP authentication value or within the query itself. But now we've made this available in the header as well, which simplifies requests slightly. And these new docs, this new API is in preview. We are announcing breaking changes as they happen in our breaking changes log, which is linked in the docs that you can find at circleci.com/docs/API/v2. Another new addition to go along with the V2 API is the Insights endpoint. So this gives you some more insight into how your pipelines, workflows, and jobs are running. With this, we've also exposed the number of credits that the pipeline, workflow, or job have consumed. As you can see in this short example here, so we've got an ID for a pipeline. You can see the status of it, how long it ran, and then how many credits were used, which is calculated based on how long the job ran and the executor size. And there's various other data points available from this endpoint as well. This is just a small sampling to give some context for what would be returned. API v2 also introduces pipeline parameters, which goes hand in hand with pipelines and how we are processing configurations going forward. This is a replacement if you are already using the v1 API. This is a replacement to the build parameters body that would be included in a request if you're injecting environment variables. So rather than injecting environment variables, this behaves similar to how an orb behaves, where instead of injecting into the environment, it instead replaces it in the configuration. And this helps be a little bit more transparent. As you can see in this example here, we have the parameters already defined. and these are defined in a very similar way to how we define them in Orbs, and they do behave fairly similar to how Orbs behave as well. So as you can see, we've defined a 2-parameter, we've given it a type, just as we did with the orb, and then we've echoed that out by accessing it with pipeline.parameters.to. And then if we made an API request with the parameters 2 populated, this would replace that value in the configuration on our end, which greatly simplifies it which greatly simplifies the execution of commands based on dynamic values from the API calls. The new UI is something that we've been rolling out slowly. It's actually been an opt-in beta for a little while now, so some of you may already be opted in. This does currently require pipelines to be enabled, but we do have functionality to include previous or older projects as well. So it's built with pipelines in mind first. We've made several performance improvements to it. So previously, very large logs would slow down the browser considerably. We've made some improvements to that. We've also made it easier for ourselves to add new features down the line with our new waffle architecture, which we have detailed in a blog post. It essentially boils down to a baseline feature set, and then we can add back functionality later down the line, one at a time. We've also made some tweaks to the workflow map. Previously, it could get a little bit cluttered. This is a little bit of an extreme example from the open source PyTorch project. But we've made some efforts to make it clearer where jobs are leading and how they feed into each other. We're going to cap off this section of the webinar with backwards compatibility. So for the most part, older configurations from 2.0 will continue to work just fine when pipelines are enabled. We've put a lot of effort into ensuring that these configurations are essentially untouched in terms of behavior. And this will also help alleviate the fact that pipelines cannot be disabled once they have been enabled. From this example here at the bottom here, you can see we have a very basic configuration where we're only defining a single job. We don't have any workflows. Our version could be 2.0, it could be 2.1. And then you can see how our layer is actually upgrading that. So it's adding workflows and wrapping that job into the workflow so that it can be used with our new pipelines infrastructure and configuration processing. And as I mentioned before, the new UI that we will be rolling out does have compatibility with legacy jobs. And with that, we will go ahead and move into the Q&A, where we will be answering any questions.
Hi, Gabe. It's Angelisa. I do have a question about the API. As we move into the V2 API, will I still be able to use the V1 API moving forward, or will that be sunset?
So we do not currently have plans to sunset the V1 and V1.1 APIs. So you will still be able to use them. When that time does eventually come, we will be sure to announce that well ahead of time.
Thank you.
Hey, Gabe, it's Jonathan, and I'm going to switch gears on you with Orbs. Question, how does Orb versioning work?
So there's sort of three different ways that orb versioning works. So there's the what we consider the production version, which only an administration of the organization who owns that orb would be able to do. And so this would be things like 0. Or like 1.0 releases. And then there's a volatile version, which will just be whichever is the latest version, is generally not recommended. And then there's also I don't recall the exact naming for this, but I believe it's the development or staging version, which anybody from an organization can push to, um, but it has to be explicitly defined in a configuration to be used, um, and is not exposed directly in the orb registry.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
No problem.
To kind of touch on orbs again, so in terms of orb namespaces, how does one get a namespace?
Good question. So namespaces are claimed or can be claimed through our CircleCI command line interface, which can be downloaded from GitHub. Um, and so you would use that. There's some very good documentation on the Orbs page as well on how to claim that. You will need to have the correct permissions in the version control provider. So in GitHub and Bitbucket, you would have to be an administrator to claim the namespace. And I can't remember the exact commands, but it's all laid out in the Orb documentation at circleci.com/orbs.
Awesome. Thanks.
One last one, just kind of on the viewing pipelines in the new UI, and I think it's something we were discussing earlier in the week just as a team. If I look at the old UI and I see jobs and I see in the new UI it's pipelines, are those the same thing? Is it different? What does that
Yeah,
mean? I think
so
is what
the old UI was definitely focused around jobs. Um, the new UI is focused around pipelines, which is going to sit above the workflows. And for the most part, that is going to, um, or sorry, pardon me. So projects are actually going to sit above the um, pipelines and the workflows. So the um,
Yeah, that sounds right, because we're moving to that project-centric view, I think, essentially.
Yeah, it's much more project centric rather than job centric. The I'm not super familiar with how the new UI is going to handle older jobs and what that looks like, but I do know that it is compatible and that is being uh, built in.
Yeah, I think that's what we've seen too. Just had to throw that question out there. Thanks, Gabe.
So since the V2 API is pipelines focused, will customers still be able to trigger workflows then with the V2 API rather than just pipelines?
I'm I'm fairly sure that you'll be able to pass through a specific, or you'll be able to trigger a specific workflow. However, it's more usual that a pipeline will instead be triggered. But that is something that is likely answered by the docs.
Thanks. Yeah, I figured probably through other parameters, we could probably specify which workflow we'd want to run, maybe with the when step, for example, on the workflow
Yeah,
level.
so the pipeline parameters would be able to play a part in that as well.
Okay, great.
Wait to see if any other questions come in here. I think this was a generic question around tagging. Let me see if I can phrase this correctly. It's like when we tag a commit on a non-default branch, that shouldn't change with the new pipelines. I guess the questions around, okay, so when we tag a commit on a non-default branch, if we enable pipelines after the fact, will our job still trigger? Yeah, that's what we're looking at. So the question is, if we tag a commit after on a non-default branch, after enabling pipelines, will the job still trigger?
I believe that it should. There shouldn't be any change to existing behavior um, as far as jobs and triggering are concerned.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
And to touch on that, I did see that there is a request to also have the API version 2 show builds that were triggered by tags, because they don't at the moment. So that's also good to know. So in the pipelines view, can we then view scheduled workflows still? Like if I have cron jobs?
Yeah, so those will show up as their own pipeline. Um, so the workflow will still run, and it will have a pipeline sitting above it as well.
And that would be part of the same workflow, or it would be in a separate pipeline then? How would that look in the UI?
Yeah, so the cron workflow would appear as a separate pipeline from the other running pipelines in the user interface.
Okay, awesome, thanks.
Gabe, I think that's kind of the end of the incoming questions. Is there anything else that you want to touch on?
I don't believe so. I highly encourage everyone to check out Orbs. That is definitely one of the biggest features that we are shipping with this. Um, the reading through the docs, ensuring that your configurations are ready for pipelines, because we are going to be pushing more people towards them to get them onto our new infrastructure, and ensuring that their configurations are processed with the new processing methods as well. Yeah, but I think that's about it.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you.